Dear students, this is the fourth lecture of our cultural studies series, and this has been titled as Cultural Studies Meaning, Scope and Aim. When we used to be students, there was a saying that perhaps it is relevant even today also, that philosophy is the mother of all subjects. We cannot claim the same stature for cultural studies, but certainly cultural studies in the recent times has developed itself as a kind of a discipline among all disciplines. It is an area which invites multidisciplinarity, and it is an area in which a great number of academicians belonging to humanities and social sciences are interested. The theorists, the anthropologists, the sociologists, the historians, the linguists, the psychology people, they are all interested in cultural studies as an academic discipline. And cultural studies is interested in the process by which power relations between different human groups and even power relations within one single group organize cultural artifacts and its meaning. So this is a very prime and this is a very basic concern of cultural studies, that it is interested in the processes by which power relations between different human groups and even power relations within one single human group organize cultural artifacts and their meanings. Culture, as you know, has been defined as something which cultivates. I mean, the dictionary meaning of the term culture is to cultivate. It also means to honor, to protect. Coming from the ancient terms cultura and colere, culture has been taken as something which is the best and the most representative in our society, in our civilization. But this is not the view of cultural studies. Before the advent of cultural studies, or you can say that till 19th century, culture, especially in the Western countries in Europe, has been regarded as the best in civilization. It meant the habits, the customs, and the tastes of the civilized and cultured upper class people of the society. But culture in cultural studies means differently. In cultural studies, culture is the mode of generating meanings and ideas. This is a mode of negotiation over which meanings are valid. And we very well know, we discussed it in our previous lecture also, that meanings are always governed by power relations. We said, we discussed in our earlier lecture, earlier video, that words do not have their own meaning. Meaning is arbitrarily given to them, and the meaning which is arbitrarily given to them is controlled by the society. Especially, it is controlled by those who are at the helm of power. So, meanings are governed by power relations, and it is our elite culture that controls meanings because it controls the terms of discourse, and it controls the terms of discourse because it controls the political, social, religious, and economic power. So that is why the non elite views on life and art are rejected as something tasteless, useless. They are called even stupid by the elites. The non elites' view, I repeat, on life and art are rejected as tasteless, useless, and even stupid by the elites. Dear friends, this implies that certain components of culture get more visibility and significance. This also implies that certain other components of culture may not get more visibility and significance. Cultural studies, in its gamut of discussions and in its gamut of interest, cultural studies takes a lot of things from popular culture. It is basically popular culture in which cultural studies finds its first beginning. So, popular culture, and what is popular culture? Popular culture is the set of beliefs, values, and practices that are widely shared by a large number of people. Popular culture is the culture of the large number of the people of society, of the human community or the human communities, you can say. So, popular culture is about the beliefs, values, and practices of the larger number of the population. Popular culture, as I said a while ago, that it is the culture of the masses. So, it is the culture of the everybody life of a large number of population. Let us try to understand this through an example, a kind of a binary example of binaries, and I hope I'll be able to make my point clear without saying anything. Dear friends, take the example of graffiti or the comic books. I think that you will believe that they are the part of popular culture because they are used by a large number of population. My dear friends, compare this or oppose this graffiti with classics. Compare a comic book or compare a graffiti with a classic text. Compare mass cinema with art cinema. Take the example of popular music and oppose this with classical music. Take the example of the open spaces of the city, the picnic spots, the public spots, and compare this with special kind of occasions organized, for example, art galleries. Take the example of mass sports and compare this, oppose this with a sport like billiards or golf. I hope you will believe and you will agree that graffitis, comic books, mass cinema, popular cinema, the culture of open spaces of the city, the picnic spots and the public spots, the culture of mass sports. This is popular culture, and this is certainly practiced by a large number of population of the society, as opposed to what we said earlier, a classic text or art cinema or classical music or the culture of art galleries or, for example, a sport like billiards or golf. So you will agree once again at this point that these are the things, these are the artifacts belonging to the culture of the elites. For a long time, my dear friends, the things belonging to, the artifacts belonging to, and the ideas belonging to popular culture were dismissed as inferior. They were looked as things of low culture. The term mass culture was used pejoratively, and the only true culture, it was believed, it was said that the only true culture was the culture of the elite. The culture of the wealthy minority section of the population was projected as a standard or true culture. This was also referred as the high culture. Academic studies also used to look at great works of art. This is a phrase, this is a term which we often use, great works of art. Academic studies also use a term classical authors or classical text. So these academic studies used to look at great work of art or classical text or classical authors and ignored the fact that the greatest number of people never viewed these art forms or read these classical authors. So the standards of judgment and ideas of taste were framed using the elite forms as examples. The forms belonging to the elite were made the parameters. It was made the standard. It was made the norm of assessing culture and assessing the taste of the people. So, standards of judgment and ideas of taste were framed using forms, elite forms as examples. Certain authors and certain forms, certain specific kind of music, certain specific kind of architecture, for example, was given respectability as culture. The very term culture till 19th century was associated, till 19th century Europe, was associated with a smaller section of the population and their so-called tastes. The upper class, which was a clear minority, had the right to legitimize or illegitimize certain artifacts as culture. I think it is my personal opinion that the upper class is still in minority, but it still holds the right to legitimize or illegitimize certain aspects, or balki majority of the aspects of culture. So the upper class, which is a clear majority, legitimizes or illegitimizes certain artifacts as culture. For example, great awe, great aura, great respect, great admiration has been associated with the paintings of Pablo Picasso or Leonardo da Vinci, the writings of Tagore or the writings of Shakespeare have been looked with an aura of respectability and a great awe. The films of Satyajit Ray are looked with an aura of respectability. So the upper class was and has always been in a position to legitimize or illegitimize the artifacts of culture. However, with the advent of cultural studies in the second half of the 20th century, there was a change in this approach. At least in the Western world, in the 1950s and in the 1960s, the scholar started taking interest in popular culture, or rather taking serious interest in popular culture. They demolished the wall of high culture and low culture, and they said that culture is culture, there is nothing low or high about it. They demolished the concept of an elitist culture, and they started in the 1950s and 1960s of the previous century. They started taking interest in the studies of popular culture. And in this change in approach, the Birmingham Center of Contemporary Cultural Studies, located at Birmingham University, Great Britain, or you can say England, played a very important role. We will talk about this Birmingham Center of Contemporary Cultural Studies and its contribution later on. Dear friends, at this juncture, let me bring in a discussion, a very short discussion about the role played by a specific department and some of the courses introduced by that specific department of an American in a university. Dear friends, Bowling Green University at Ohio, America, established a department of popular culture, and which introduced a few courses on culture and cultural studies, or you can say a few courses on popular culture. And this very department of popular culture of Bowling Green University at Ohio, America, that published a journal in the year 1969 called as the Journal of Popular Culture. And this journal, for the first time, took a discussion on comics seriously. I mean, they made papers, they made researches on the Spider-Man series comics or different comic books. They made serious studies in rock music. They made serious studies in detective films. They also made serious studies in amusement parks and picnic spots and famous public spots. So, my dear friends, cultural studies as a discipline argues that objects and artifacts that are used by masses must be taken seriously. It argues that culture is about the meanings a society or community generates. But yes, this process of generating meaning is difficult. And why it is difficult? This process of generating meaning is difficult because those in power try to control the meaning. They try to control the discourse. They try to control the cultural artifacts and the cultural ideas. They try to prevail upon the cultural artifacts, the cultural ideas, and the process of generating discourse and meaning. So that is why, because of this approach of trying to hold a control over discourse and meaning, because of this reason, certain artifacts are treated superior and certain artifacts are treated inferior. Let us take, for example, a few English authors. Shakespeare, for example, Jane Austen, for example, the Bronte sisters, for example. Those who are the students of English literature specifically, they know that Shakespeare in his times, when he started writing, was not accepted readily by the contemporary writers of his time. He was not accepted by the university wits. I hope you understand. He was said as a crow among the cranes, and the same Shakespeare during his lifetime itself, in the Elizabethan and in the later Jacobean period, was the most important author of their times. Jane Austen, my dear friends, for example, do remember that what kind of hardships she faced to be accepted as a writer. And the same Jane Austen nowadays, who was regarded as in the 19th century, was who was facing problems and hardships to be accepted as a novelist, is now a very respectable and a very respected and a very acclaimed, acknowledged, admired, revered novelist of English literature. She has been canonized, she has been standardized as a classic author. And we are very well aware about the case of the Bronte sisters. Even they have to they have to hide their meaning, they have to hide their name, their original name, and they were written off. They were striked off as authors or as novelists. And when you study the life of the Bronte sisters, right, you know that the kind of angst that was there in them, the kind of frustration that was there in them, because of this rejection by the contemporary literary world. But the same Bronte sisters are now regarded as the classic authors of English literature. And my dear friends, what about Agatha Christie? So now, if you can compare Agatha Christie with Shakespeare, Jane Austen, or the Bronte sisters at present, you will know the difference. That there is some kind of an superiority associated with Shakespeare, Jane Austen, and Bronte sisters, and there is some kind of an inferiority associated with a writer like Agatha Christie. My dear friends, at this juncture, let us introduce a topic of cultural studies, and it runs like the production and consumption of culture. Yes, my dear friends, culture is not a normal happening thing. It is not happening naturally around us. It is created. It is produced. So, cultural studies as a field, as a stream of academics, believes that the culture of a group or a community includes various aspects. And what are those various aspects? Cultural culture of a group or community includes economics, economic aspects, spatial aspects, ideological aspects, the erotic aspects, and the political aspects. So this is a belief of cultural studies that the culture of a group or the culture of a community includes various aspects such as the economic, the spatial, the ideological, the erotic, and the political. Therefore, cultural studies aims to include all these aspects in its ambit. Cultural studies tries to include the economic, the spatial, the ideological, the erotic, and the political aspect in the ambit of its discussion. It seeks to understand how particular objects acquire meaning and value. So, as I said earlier, culture is not a natural thing, my dear friends. It is produced. And you will agree, perhaps, that something which is produced will surely be consumed. Hence, cultural studies as a field of academics is interested in the production and consumption of culture. And friends, this production and consumption of culture is linked to three things. Number one, the production and culture of consumption is linked to the matters of class. I mean, who decides on what is going to be produced? Number two, the production and consumption of culture is linked to the matters of economy. Who can afford it? And number three, the production and consumption of culture is linked to the matters of representation, the matters of marketing, that how the cultural produce, how the cultural artifact, how the cultural idea that is produced is going to be presented, is going to be marketed. So, like any materialistic item, like any materialistic goods, the production and the consumption of cultural studies is also linked with the matters of class, that who decides what is being produced. It is also related to the matter of economy, that who can afford it, and it is also related to the matter of representation. It is also related to the matter of marketing, that how is the artifact going to be presented, how is the cultural artifact going to be marketed. So the production and consumption of culture is linked to power and identity, the identity of class, and the question of power is very important in the production and consumption of culture. The production as well as the consumption of culture defines identity. If you are producing as a specific artifact of, of culture, if you are producing a specific idea of culture, if you are producing, if you are consuming any artifact of culture or any idea of culture, if you are presenting or marketing any artifact of culture, it will surely show your status with regard to power and your identity. So, my dear friends, culture is a product that is made, marketed, and consumed. Now, my dear friend, at this juncture, let us try to understand the relation between power and culture. Uh, Let us begin with a question, that why is Shakespeare prescribed in the syllabi of English departments across the world? And why not Agatha Christie has been prescribed? And this question gives rise to another question, that who decides that Shakespeare must be read by the students and Agatha Christie must not be read by the students? Let us raise another question in order to understand culture and power, or power and culture. Let us raise another question, that why exhibitions of either tribal culture or the Swadesi melas are organized for the elite people of the city, and who gains the economic benefits from selling the tribal or indigenous artifacts? You can very well understand that there is a trend, there is a fashion of organizing tribal melas, tribal the fairs based on tribal culture. And there is a trend of selling tribal and indigenous artifacts. We are all very well aware about the Delhi Haat in the national capital of India. We are also very well aware that there is a trend in recent days of organizing Swadesi melas in the big cities of India. The question is that why these exhibitions, why these sale of tribal artifacts and indigenous artifacts in the for the elite people, for the purchase of the elite people in the big cities. And related to this is the question that who gains economic benefits from selling the tribal or indigenous artifacts. My dear friends, these are not simple questions of culture. These are not simple cultural questions. They involve politics and they involve the aspects of power. Shakespeare or the tribal artifact acquire legitimacy because somebody has decided that they are legitimate and valued. So, cultural issues are mediated through the questions of economy or politics or both. Hence, my dear friends, it is said that culture is power or culture is about power. Let us now bring in some sort of history, a bit of history of cultural studies in our discussion here. We know it very well that cultural studies as an academic discipline came up in Europe, particularly England, in the second half of the previous century, the 20th century. So it was in the 1950s and 1960s that cultural studies grew, and it grew because of the rise of interest in popular culture among the Western societies. This is what I said earlier also, that it is in cultural studies that, sorry, it is in popular culture that cultural studies first finds its interest. So, cultural studies as an academic field grew in the 1950s and 1960s, in the second half of the 20th century, because of the rise of interest in popular culture among the Western societies. The spread of television, interest in music, and other cultural estates, youth movements like jazz or beat or hippie resulted in the rise of popular culture and brought it to the forefront of scrutiny and discourse. So, this spread of television in the previous century, my dear friends, and the spread in popular music and other cultural states, and the rise of several youth movements like the jazz movement or the beat movement or the hippie movement, it all resulted in the rise of popular culture, and it brought to the forefront and it brought popular culture to the forefront of scrutiny and discourse among the academic field. I mean, among the academicians, you can say. So, within the academia, cultural anthropologists, sociologists, historians, psychologists, the people related to theory, the political scientists, these kind of people began to express their greater interest in social history, especially in the history of those subordinated groups like women, like the African Americans, like the slaves, like the colonized, like the marginalized, and in the Indian context, you can include the Dalits, the Adivasis, the minorities. So, within the academia, the cultural anthropologists, the historians, the sociologists, the political scientists, the psychologists, and the people belonging to theory, they began to express their greater interest in social history, especially the history of the subordinated groups of women, of African Americans, of Dalits, for example, of Adivasis, for example, of minority class, for example, of the colonized and the marginalized strata of the society. So the scholars, like, let us take the specific name of two or three scholars, and let us now bring in our discussion related to the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies also. So the scholars and theorizers like Willis, Stuart Hall, and Morley at the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, BCCS, these scholars focused on the working class. They focused on the dissident youths, and they also focused on the television personalities, and they also focused on the audiences. I mean, how the audience behave, the nature and behavior of the audiences. So the tone of this early version of cultural studies was set by the students of the British New Left. In my previous lecture also, somewhere I said that cultural studies has its seeds in Marxism. So it was the British New Left and the students belonging to the British New Left that set the tone of the early version of cultural studies. Richard Hoggart and Raymond Williams, both as students, were having working class backgrounds, and they played, I mean, as scholars, these two, Richard Hoggart and Raymond Williams, played a very pivotal role in the settling of the early tone of cultural studies as a field of academics. Students with working class backgrounds, mostly the first generation learners, carried their own cultures into their classrooms. They carried their interpretations of their own culture into their classrooms, and they were bewildered. They were aghast to see that their culture had no role in the literature programs and in the literature syllabi of the British universities. The emphasis on high culture texts, the great work of art thing, So, this emphasis on high culture texts and the classics meant a sort of an alienation for these students. And to add to this, we had the labor union movements, feminist movements, anti-racist movements in Britain during the 1960s and 1970s. And this played a very important role in the settling of the early tone of cultural studies as an academic discipline. There was a nostalgia for the student radicalism movements based on cultural identities. Movements like the gay lesbian movement, as I said, the different kind of feminism or the different kind of feminist movements, the different kind of, you can say, race based movements. So the whole aim during those 1960s and 70s, when the early tone of early cultural studies was getting settled, the whole aim was to politicize the identities. Look here. The whole aim was to politicize the identities. So this quest was concretized into a study of youth subculture as the site of new political future. Site, SITE. Culture, and especially popular culture, became the scene of a struggle. Scene, SCENE. So, my dear friends, what I'm doing is that I'm introducing one or two key terms of cultural studies also. So, this whole quest, this whole interest in the student movements, in the feminist movements, in the radical movements, in the identity based movements, labor union movements, and this whole quest concretized into a study of youth subculture as the site of new political future. Culture, and especially popular culture, became the scene of a struggle. And in the tradition of these subculture studies and movements of the 1960s and 1970s, that cultural studies sought to search and theorize the agency among these identities. Dear friends, let us talk a bit more about the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies. The works of Raymond Williams led the way for the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in the 1970s. The approach, as we have said earlier also, the approach behind cultural studies was clearly Marxist. And the theory that they adopted, I mean the cultural studies people, it adopted the theoretical insights from post-structuralism. So the initial debates at the center, or generated by the center, by center I mean the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. So the initial debates at the center, or generated by the center, were revolving around textuality, in which culture, identity, and even nation were looked as texts or narratives. So the whole emphasis was on, the whole debate was basically, not emphasis, the whole debate was centering around textuality of the things, textuality of the cultural artifacts, textuality of the cultural ideas. And my dear friends, as I said, that culture or cultural artifacts, culture or cultural ideas were seen as texts or narratives. Identities were seen as texts or narratives. And even nation was also seen as a text or a narrative. At this juncture, let us bring in a course that was introduced by the Open University in England. This Open University in England offered a 1 year diploma interdisciplinary course which was titled as Popular Culture. The course itself was titled as Popular Culture. And interesting, it is interesting to note that this course was coordinated by Tony Bennett, who is a very important name in cultural studies. And this course on popular culture offered by the Open University of England was evaluated by scholars like Terry Eagleton and Raymond Williams. So this was the currency that cultural studies has started gaining during those days, during that second half of the previous century. Let us now once again bring in the Birmingham Center. The Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies aimed to interrogate the part that popular culture plays within our life. So it was no more seen as something which is the best and the most representative of our life. It was basically the aspect of everyday life. Each and every aspect of everyday life was seen as a cultural artifact, was seen as a cultural idea. So the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies aimed to interrogate the part that popular culture plays within our life. The center held the notion that the distinction between high culture and low culture was untenable. It is actually nothing to be think about, nothing to ponder about. There's nothing like high culture and low culture. So this notion, this distinction between high culture and low culture, according to the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies, was untenable. Towards the end of our discussion here, please allow me to bring in Stuart Hall. This man in the 1980s, or rather in the 1970s and in the 1980s, played a very important role in the establishment of cultural studies as an academic field. His very famous essay, almost an epochal essay titled Cultural Studies Two Paradigms, set the tone for the interrogation of this concept of high culture and low culture. Hall suggested, my dear friends, that subjects were not constitutive and culturally expressive. Subjects and expressions are both, according to Stuart Hall, determined by structures of social signification. I would like to repeat and listen to me carefully, because we are going to introduce a very important aspect here. Stuart Hall said that Stuart Hall suggested that subjects were not constitutive and culturally expressive. Subjects and expressions are both determined by structures of social signification. And what are these structures of social signification popularly called as? This structure is popularly called as hegemony. Hegemony, that ideological structure that enables the dominant class to legitimize, naturalize, and retain power. You know that culture power link? So, this hegemony, this structure of social signification, is nothing but the ideological structure, according to Stuart Hall, that enables the dominant classes to legitimize, to naturalize, and to retain power. This hegemony gives them, I mean, the dominant class of the society, this hegemony of power, the power of economics, the power of politics, the power of religion, and several other things you can say. So, this hegemony, this ideological structure enables the dominant class to legitimize certain things and to illegitimize certain things, to canonize certain authors and not to canonize some other authors. So, the ideological structure Hegemony is that ideological structure that enables the dominant classes to legitimize, to naturalize, and to retain power. So, the course on popular culture, which I mentioned earlier, the course that was introduced by the Open University of England, that course on popular culture had two main assumptions about text, reader, and position. Listen to me carefully once again. The course on popular culture, which we mentioned earlier, had two main assumptions with regard to text, reader, and position. And what is this? Number one, textual positioning was understood as a way to answer the question that why does this text think you are? Sorry, who does this text think you are? Position is defined in terms of content, assumption, tastes, and values. And number two, position is also the process by which the signifier and the signified operate to constitute the subject. My dear friends, at this juncture, I would like to bring in that what is the signifier, the sign, the word, or the image is the signifier. And what is the signifier? The meaning, the concept associated with the sign, word, or image is the signified. And what is the subject? The reader. The reader, the viewer, the consumer, the user is the subject. So I was saying, my dear friend, and let me repeat it once again, that the course on popular culture had two main assumptions about text. And what is a text? A text is not a normal text that we understand. Culture is also a text. The cultural artifact and the cultural idea is also a text. And as we said, even identities are also texts, and nations are also texts. So the course on popular culture had two main assumptions about text, reader, and position. Number one, textual positioning was understood as a way to answer the question that who does this text think you are? And position is defined in terms of content, in terms of assumption, tastes, and values. And what is number two? Position is also the process by which the signifier, sign, word, image, and the signified meaning and concept operate to constitute the subject, the reader, the viewer. So, my dear friends, this emphasis on discourse and textuality remains central to cultural studies. Even today, this emphasis on discourse and this emphasis on textuality remains central to cultural studies. Subjects, identities, and relationships are constructed out of discourse, and they deliver meanings only in the act of differentiation. Subjects, identities, and relationships are constructed out of discourse, and they deliver meanings only in the act of differentiation. To end our discussion, let us now once again bring in Stuart Hall's very seminal work titled Cultural Studies: Two Paradigms. And this has been a trendsetter in cultural studies. An earlier essay by Hall also was a trendsetter, an essay which talked about encoding and decoding. It was first published in 1973, and this essay on encoding and decoding set the scene for cultural studies for media. So the essay argued that meaning within texts, and let us once again try to understand what the text is. Songs are texts, paintings are texts, television serials, television soaps are texts, a musical concert is a text, an archaeological site is a text, an architectural monument is a text. So the essay by Hall argued that the meaning within texts are organized through the operation of certain codes. Hall argues that the apparatuses, the relations, and the practices of production appear as symbolic vehicles within language. So that's all, my dear friend, from our side. In our next lecture, we will be talking about the methods of cultural studies. And this discussion, the next discussion, is going to be a very important discussion for us, in which, as I am saying, we will discuss in detail, in broad details, about the different methods that are used in cultural studies. Thank you very much.